الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Continuing our lessons on the flag bearers of Islam. This week, inshallah, we're going to do the biography of a scholar from the 13th century/14th century. A scholar which many of us are familiar with, but not too much about his life. And that's none other than the scholar Al-Allama Taqiuddin Al-Hilali, rahimahullah rahmatan wasi'ah. This scholar Taqiuddin Al-Hilali, many of us are familiar with his name because of the translation of the Noble Quran. And the translation of the Quran, which I have in front of me, is translated by both Taqiuddin Al-Hilali and Muhsin Khan. So when we read the title, we know both names, familiar with these names, but we're not familiar with the biography of this Imam. Because Muhsin Khan translated alongside Al-Hilali, but Al-Hilali is the one who, if you read, you see that he is the one who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the ability not only to translate this work, but many others into foreign languages. A scholar from the scholars of Ahl Sunnah, one who was called to da'wah of Salafiyah. And we'll mention his biography and some of the amazing stories of this great Imam as inspiration for us to be active in da'wah because of his great legacy in this field. Shaykh Taqiuddin Hilali, rahimahullah, he grew up and was living in an era where there were still changes in the world. Right? We're talking about early 1900s, mid-1900s, when the world was still going through, especially in the Muslim world, this modernist influence. And people were not yet awakened truly to the da'wah of truth as we see today. So the Shaykh, rahimahullah, he was born in the year 311 in Morocco. And he was born in a town, but it was close to a major city known as Sijil Masa. And this Shaykh, his full name, Muhammad Taqiuddin, that's his laqab, Ibn Abdul Qadir. Muhammad Taqiuddin Ibn Abdul Qadir Al-Hilali Al-Husayni Al-Maghribi. And his kunya was Abu Shakib. So born 1311 Hijri in one of the villages in the city of Sijil Masa, present day Kingdom of Morocco. And the Shaykh, he grew up obviously underneath the tutelage of his father, who he studied the Quran with him and memorized the entire Quran at 12 years of age. And after that, he began to memorize the basic mutun, the basic manuals of fiqh. Most students would study, and children, Mukhtasar Khalil. And then he would, after that, learn Arabic grammar, Maliki fiqh, and other forms of knowledge. So he was one who he began his studies in Islamic knowledge at a young age. And we have to remember he's coming from Morocco. And some of us were not familiar, but there was da'wah there in Morocco. But he is one of the, you might say, the second Shaykh of our present era to bring Salafiyah to Morocco, to bring da'wah to haqq to that area. There's a scholar preceded him named Shaykh Abu Shu'aib, but later on it was him who made the influence. And we'll read some of the stories of how he preached the da'wah to the people. So after he finished his primary studies, he needed to continue, so he continued to his studies in the city of Fez. And later on he went and got a shahada, university degree, bachelor's degree from Jami' al-Qayrawan in Tunis, or Tunisia. Then, continuing his studies, he went to Egypt in the year 1340 to learn hadith. And what you notice about Shaykh Hilali is that he had studies both traditional and academic. So you'll see everywhere he goes, he's learning, teaching. So he's balancing between both. He had degrees, and he also had the ilm from the traditional mashayikh. And we'll see later on, all of these efforts of education were all to promote the Islam. He wasn't learning it for anything else but to do da'wah. But when he went to Egypt, before that, we should know he grew up in the environment of Morocco where the da'wah of Salafiyah, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah wasn't popular. So what he was influenced with, as he mentions in his own words, was by the Sufis. He was influenced by the tariqah known as Tijaniyah. Tijaniyah was popular in that region. If someone knows anything about West Africa, that's the region, even North Africa, that's the tariqah that's popular. So he was upon other than the right way in the beginning of his talab. When he went to Egypt, he met the biggest ulama there. For example, Shaykh Abdul Zahir Abu Samah, who was the Imam of the Haram at that time. He also met the influential scholar Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida, who seems to have one of the greatest influences on him and opened for him some doors. Because at that time, in Egypt, the influence was with that madrasa. Jama'uddin Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and then Muhammad Rashid Rida. Even though he was better than them in rectifying affairs, of course they were further away from the Sunnah. He had his share of mistakes, but he's the one who influenced him a lot about the Islam and reforming Islam or going back to the Sunnah. And then he also met Shaykh Muhammad Hamid al-Faqih. So this scholar, Shaykh Muhammad Hamid, he really influenced him upon the Sunnah and the Deen. Because in Egypt that time, these ulama represented the Da'wah al-Sunnah, and he studied with them and he recanted from all his ways of the past. Means whatever he was upon of the way of the Tijaniyah. He wrote a book refuting it, and he actually made tawbah ila Allah from that way. When he went to Egypt, he learned the Sunnah. From that then on, from 1430 Hijri all the way to the rest of his life, he became dedicated to calling people to da'wah, towards Sunnah. And we'll get to that later on, all the things that he did to do that. But even in Egypt, he began calling people in the beginning stages, making mistakes, as any student and da'iyah in the beginning does, and later on learning from those mistakes. But what happened was, he studied and he learned and he remained there. And he even joined some of the lessons, means in the higher education, Azhar. And he remained in Egypt for a year, calling people to the Aqeedah, the Salaf al-Salih, warning against shirk, and explaining, clarifying the way of this tariqah Tijaniyah not being correct. And from then he then traveled to Hajj, he went to Mecca, and then from Mecca, after learning the hadith, and he finished what he could there, he went to India. And what we notice with the Shaykh is a globetrotter. He went everywhere to learn and to study. And we'll mention some of the instances in Egypt after he became awakened to do the Sunnah. He began calling people towards Islam. And he realized that people, especially in his era, they were not very familiar with the truth. And so his name became popular to many people, and of course he got into some issues. So it mentions now one example, one of his stories of da'wah, in which he called the people to Islam, and before that he had some difficulties. So what happened was, he says in his own words, for the Shaykh, he wrote a lot about his own life. There's actually a book, it compiles all his rasail, all his letters and his treaties that he wrote. So he has a book that covers most of his da'wah, called Da'wah ila Allah fi al-Aqtar al-Mukhtalifa. Da'wah ila Allah throughout across the world, in different lands. So he mentions this story that in the beginning of his da'wah, again he's learning the way of the Salaf, the way of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam giving da'wah. He used to join with the people and just blend in with them and try to teach them whatever he can, especially because he didn't have any income to support him da'wah. So sometimes he would pretend to be from that group, the Tijaniyah, just in order to get some support. But then he said, I made the decision not to cheat nor to act like a hypocrite when it comes to religion for as long as I live. Means I should be open with my da'wah, I should be telling people about the Sunnah from day one. That led him obviously to a situation where he didn't have any money or any support. Nonetheless, he would go village to village and he would call people to Islam, especially in Upper Egypt. And his name became very popular amongst the Awam because they came to his lessons. And so what happened once was, one of the locals who was had authority, who was from this tariqah, he was upset with this man. So he called one of the professors from Azhar to debate with him. And Taqiuddin Hilali, rahimahullah, he didn't like to debate. And he mentioned that he didn't take that to be the correct way, and he left that for a while. And this is important advice, because debate is not always for the sake of Allah, and not always it is a way to guide people. Sometimes it's necessary, as he said. In that case, you have to seek Allah's assistance and have parameters. Right? Just debating openly, we know it's not the way of the pious predecessors, because it can lead to shubuhat, doubts, and move you from the Sunnah, move you from the Sarat al-Mustaqim. So what happened was, because they invited this Azhari Shaykh to debate him about issue of Tawheed and Shirk and Sufi and this, the Shaykh, he had to debate with him. And he writes in his own words that it didn't pass 30 minutes except that I defeated him and I convinced everyone that he was wrong. And the Shaykh said that after that, he moved to the next city, and within 8 days, he guided half those cities to Salafiyah. Subhanallah. And this kind of stories that he narrates in his book, sometimes it's astonishing. It's almost hard to believe, because it happened so quickly. But many of the biographers, even the non-Muslims, admit that despite the difficulty of understanding all his stories, because it comes from him only, if you look across the different resources, it is true that he spread the Sunnah in Egypt and in Morocco, because after he left, and the Shaykh didn't stay too long in these regions, just 1 year we said, when he returned back, he found even more people on the Sunnah than he left. So even those Orientalists who studied him, they admit that even if we cannot verify the numbers, we can see that his da'wah was spreading. Rahimahullah. So this was his hal until he, of course, continued his studies, because he stayed in Egypt for that time, and he went further for further studies. So he went first to Mecca to do Hajj and to learn the Hadith, then to India, and there he went to study in different cities in Madaris, being in Lucknow, or later on he met some of the ulama of Nadwa, and the Nadwa ulama who were the big mashayikh at that time. And then he learned a hadith, because at that time, and it's still prevalent today, many of the hadith, means the 6 books of hadith and the asanid, and the memorization, preservation was happening in India. A lot of us were not familiar, but Ahlul Hind did a lot for hadith. A lot. And that's why many mashayikh, especially the ulama hadith, they attest to the fact that he preserved the books, the manuscripts, the memorization, and the asanid. So he met many mashayikh, the head of them being Shaykh Abdul Rahman and Mubarak Furi. That was his teacher. And he sat with him and studied with him. And this is unique because many of the Arabs, they didn't go that far to study in India, at least at his time, and he was one of those who went. He wasn't the only one, because he lived in the same time period as Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Muallimi. In fact, he was born before him, and he lived longer than him. I think he lived for 90 plus years. Or Shaykh Muallimi, rahimahullah, was 70 years. But he also went to India to study. So it's important. And today we have, for example, some Shaykh, Shaykh Salih al-Usaymi, and others who went to India to study. So he studied with this great Imam, and he took from him the hadith, and also Muhammad bin Hussein Ansari al-Yamani. And he stayed there until the year 1343. And again, if you read the biography of Shaykh Abdul Rahman Mubarak Furi and his student Ubaidullah and Mubarak Furi, you see that a lot of the stories were narrated from Shaykh Hilali. Nonetheless, he moved into Iraq to continue his studies. He went to Basra, and he met with any of the biggest mashayikh upon the Sunnah at that time. He was unfortunately was not able to meet some of the kibar ulama who passed, like Shaykh Mahmoud al-Shukri al-Alusi. But he met those who were from his students and those who were there, and he studied with them, and he actually taught there as a professor. The Shaykh's specialty was in Arabic language. That was his specialty, but he also learned all the other ulum. And we'll get to later on with his specialities. So he studied there, even taught there, and he remained there. And it's mentioned that he benefited a lot from the sittings in Iraq. And later he wanted to continue his studies, so he stayed 3 years there. And so Shaykh, everywhere he goes, he studies, teaches, learns, and he wants to continue. So he wanted to continue to go to Saudi Arabia to study. But at that time, he didn't have any alaqa, any connection. So Shaykh Muhammad Rasulullah wrote him a letter. And he wrote to the Malik Abdul Aziz Al Saud, saying to him that verily Muhammad Taqiuddin Hilali here, Al-Maghribi, is the best of those ulama on the land, in the world today. And I hope that you can benefit from his knowledge. Allow him to enter. And he took the then he was able to go to then stay in Saudi Arabia. This is before he came back another time. But he remained there, and he stayed there, and he was teaching and learning in the Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina for 2 years. And later also, he went to Masjid al-Haram and Ma'had Ilmi in Saudi, and he studied there for 1 year. Then after that, he went back to India and did some more da'wah, more dirasa studies. And he wanted to complete his studies, and he met some scholars there. But it was in India where the Shaykh then began being interested in learning foreign languages. And we'll say now, some biographers mention the Shaykh knew up to 9 languages. But what's most clear is that he knew 3 of them with masterful skill: Arabic, German, and English. It's important. He studied it, and he actually wrote about why you have to learn foreign languages for da'wah ila Allah. And he also became intrigued by it, because he found that many of the people, especially that time, because it was India, British India, the British were in control. So he needed to know English to know what they were saying and what was going on with the ummah. but also in ways to counter them into da'wah, because that was his goal. And so some of the scholars, they mentioned that he studied this, that even later in his life when he became blind, they mentioned he knew Braille as well. So this is a Shaykh often learning. Some Shaykh said there was no one like Shaykh Taqiuddin Hilali in our time. He was truly one of those Mashaykh who deserves the laqab Shaykh al-Islam. I mean, he did meet other ulama, but he had this uniqueness with him and all this type of knowledge from different angles. So when he was in India, he decided to learn the English, even though Urdu was there too, but he learned English. And the purpose behind it was to teach the people the deen and to also counter the influence of the British. Now, how did he learn English? This is the question. So we'll mention this from his own biography, how he learned and what he did with that English that he learned. And he also found that there was some criticism people had that he was learning these 4 languages because people thought that this is not appropriate. But he used as evidence the permissibility. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam encouraged Zayd bin Thabit, if I remember correctly, Zayd bin Thabit radiallahu anhu, to learn Hebrew. And he learned it in about 14 days. So he used these as evidences that the permissibility, even sometimes obligation, communal obligation, that some of the Muslims, they know the 4 languages. And why did he intend this? Is that because even when it comes to medicine, he said, we would have to know what's in the back of the medicine. If it's halal, if it's good for us, we don't know. Because it's translated for us in Arabic, or sometimes it's in English and we don't know. And also, he realized that by learning English, he can do more da'wah to the people in the area. So he mentioned that in order to learn, he, in 1933, so that's our time period, he became interested in learning English, and he met a Canadian Christian pastor who was there in India, and he was there obviously in Lucknow to do some type of missionary work. So he came to him and said, I wish to learn from you English. Even though the Christian thought he was doing da'wah to him, he was actually taking English to da'wah to them. So he learned from him English by sitting, and he agreed because the missionaries don't take money. So he sat with him and he learned. He used to sit in the lessons in which they teach English and the sermons, and he's just learning. And he did 3 lessons a week like this for free, until only some time passed, until he learned enough to translate from Arabic into English. And he met another Christian missionary named Mr. Smith. And he learned from him likewise, and he used to have some munaqashat with them. And so what happened was that they needed to get him a copy of the Bible, because at that time he didn't have, so they sent from London a copy of the Bible to him to read. And why am I mentioning this? Because all of us, we read the Kitab, Noble Quran. But many of us, we don't turn to the back and we see what the Shaykh wrote himself about the Christians in this book. SubhanAllah, this book here, in the end of the Noble Quran is the book. It's called Jesus Muhammad in the Bible and the Quran, Biblical Evidence of Jesus being a servant of God and having no share in divinity. He wrote this book while on this stage when he learned English, and he read the Bible cover to cover, took notes, translated what he could, and within 2 years after learning, he started to translate and write, and he actually wrote a book to respond. And this book then later on was used by the ulama as a standard work in relation to the Quran, the Bible. Rahimahullah, this high ambition that he had. So this pastor who thought he was doing da'wah was actually the opposite. And so what happened was, after these studies, continued to learn. And the Shaykh then, in his state he was in, he realized he needed more education, and he actually longed to finish his formal education. So he had his bachelor's from Jami' al-Qayrawan, but he needed then to complete his studies. He wanted to get his master's and doctorate. So what happened, one of his friends, he told him that you can get him into a German university to study and to finish his studies. And because he knew Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Ridha, who then also knew another man, who was like, his name is Arsalan, Shakib Arsalan, this man was like one of the leaders or princes of Lebanon. So because of this, even though he was a Druze, they mentioned, from the sect called Druze, he wrote for him like a tazkiyah to go to Germany and to finish his studies in University of Bonn. And he went there, and he stayed there for some time, studying, and he learned German in 1 year. And then, while there, he became part of translation in the journals and media, translating Arabic to English to the radios, channels, and this kind of media field. His job was to write and to translate from the German to English, Arabic, and like this. And while there, he continued his da'wah, and learning also other languages and coming to meet other people. He stayed there, and finally he received his doctorate in the philosophy of science in the year 1941. And that was the year many of us know that Hitler then, in Germany, took over, right? Because at that time, 1939, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and in 1940, the Second World War was called. And the Shaykh, he left at that time towards going back to Maghrib to do his da'wah. But of course, while he was there, he didn't lose the opportunity to do his da'wah. So the ulama, they mentioned in the biography that he actually met Hitler himself. And this is something to know. This is the Imam we're talking about, the Alim, Salafi, and his benefit all across the world. It mentions in his biography that once Shaykh Hilali, he was sitting in Lebanon with Shaykh Zuhair Shawish and a few others, and they asked him, how was your meeting with Hitler the day you met him? And he said that time I met him, he was very confused and silent when he met me because he didn't know me. And I sat with him and I asked him, what are you going to do about the Palestinian issue? It means the Palestine and Israel issue. What are you going to do to help the Palestinians? Or are you going to help them? And he said, possibly. And he said, from that day on, Hitler didn't meet me or see me except he honored me. And so this is the kind of Imam we're talking about in our era, rahimahullah, someone who the ulama they mention is very, very rare. Right? The polymath, the globetrotter, he went everywhere. After that, he went back to Maghrib, continued his da'wah, then to Iraq, and then he continued doing this, moving one place to another, until he found his way finally in the Jami'at, in King Muhammad V University in Morocco, in Ribat. He taught there. And later, in 1968, Shaykh bin Baz, rahimahullah, wrote a letter requesting him to come to Medina University to teach. And then he went, so that was after he studied in Medina sometime. And he came and he taught and he benefited the people. And that's when him and Muhsin Khan and others translated Sahih al-Bukhari into English and also the Noble Quran. The Shaykh is studied with so many Mashaykh, we just mentioned some of them, whether it be in every place that he went. And he also had connection with some of those Mashaykh, whether it be in India or in Saudi Arabia or in Morocco and Egypt. So he has so many Mashaykh. In terms of his books, he wrote a lot. And some of the books he wrote was about the things that he saw. So one of those books that often mention his life in detail is this book where he talks about his da'wah ila Allah, fi aqtar mukhtalifa. And there he talks about all his journeys. He also has other books, Rasail, about Tawheed. For he specializes in Tawheed. Some PhDs have come out and masters about Taqiuddin Hilali wa Juhuduhu fil Aqidah. This book teaches about how the Shaykh did da'wah and how he spread this da'wah of the Sunnah all across the world. In fact, you might even argue that once he became guided, he didn't leave any place except that he did da'wah. And I mentioned now some of the words of the ulama, praising him and his concern for the da'wah ila Allah. And this is an example for all of us. When Allah He guides you, then you work to guide others. You be active to go out, just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided you, and to be diligent in that. You find that the Shaykh, out of gratitude to Allah, that when he realized the truth, he didn't leave anywhere, west or east, Muslim or non-Muslim country, except that he taught people Tawheed, and he warned against that which was wrong, and he also encouraged the people towards the khair. So inshallah, we'll mention some of the examples of that, or the comment of the ulama about him. For example, Shaykh Hamad Ansari, rahimahullah, the great African muhaddith of Medina, he's talking about him because he met him. And he says about this Imam, he says that Taqiuddin Hilali, he traveled all across the world, even to the place all the way as far as Sweden and Norway. And the Shaykh went all the way there. He didn't leave a place east or west except that he called the people to Allah until he even reached China. And the Shaykh, he says, he did da'wah everywhere. In fact, he wrote one book where he went to the region, like North Arctic, and he found where the sun sets or only rises one half of the year and the other half. And he wrote a risala about it, how the sun only rises here. Some say it was the area of the Eskimos where they live. And the Shaykh, why did he do all of this da'wah? Because his job was, and his concern was calling people back to Tawheed. So sometimes he would open the durus and people would come. And other times he would go out to them. So an example of that, and the eagerness that he had, is that when he began doing his da'wah, sometimes people, they realized that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him this knowledge and benefit, but some people obviously didn't like it. But nonetheless, he says on one hand, he mentions here in his biography, that he would do his lessons and he would teach the people from Fath al-Majid, the Sharh al-Kitab al-Tawheed. And at other times, he would distribute the books in the lesson. And so what he did, he would ask the Saudi authorities to send him books, and he gave 343 copies to everyone in the cities in Morocco, everywhere he went. And this obviously to spread the Tawheed. So everyone has this copy of the book. Also the Mufti at that time, Shaykh Ibn Baz, would send for him money and books that he needed, anything that he wanted. And the Shaykh obviously translated the Quran itself, so he would bring that as well. And what we take from the Shaykh is that he was doing all this work for Allah's sake. And his name became popular until today. We find that even his mawaqif, you see the mawaqif that he holds, all according to the Sunnah. So for example, what he thought about Tawheed, what he wrote about the issue of tafsir, what he wrote about issues regarding fiqh. He even wrote a small book when he was in Germany. He analyzed the way the Jews and the Christians raised their kids. And he wrote a book about the Shabab and Muslim, and he compared the way the Muslims out in Germany deal with their children and the Jews and the Christians. And he took some lessons from that, how they did it, and to encourage the Muslims to become better, right, and how they do it. And that book is actually available. You can find it online. And so this Shaykh, rahimahullah, continues da'wah till the day he died. And the ulama, they mentioned that through his efforts in language, in khutab, in manadarat, and etc., he spread da'wah all across the world, but particularly in the Morocco region, and Egypt, and India even, but mainly in the Arab world. And his name now comes synonymous with him, Mashaykh. And of course, for the English speakers, all of us, we know him by way of his translation. Also, we find in him great lessons, how he will learn from himself the mistakes that he made and the things that he did. So for example, he mentions that he wouldn't debate people, and he learned from himself that he wouldn't, after that debate and the debates, that he would avoid debating and instead focus on calling people to Allah. He also would focus on trying his best to translate the different works into different languages so the foreigners and non-Arab can understand. And even he made efforts to teach them English. And he mentioned in some of his journals, he had a journal called Taqiuddin, and in there he would translate at the end passages from Arabic to English and teach some basic English. Even some passages from Shakespeare to teach the Arab how to read English, so they can become more acquainted with the different languages. And when it comes to also the subjects, we find the Shaykh was one who specialized in every subject. We find that he was specialized in Arabic, in Arabic literature, in the Quran, in tafsir, in hadith. But despite that, all of these efforts, what made him most unique was obviously his focus on the da'wah ila Allah. And there's much more to mention about him because the books have been written. Like I said, a few PhDs have been presented, even some in English, we find. There's a PhD in English called The Evolution of the Salafiyya in the 20th Century through the life and thought of Taqiuddin Hilali. And presented in Georgetown University, one researcher gathered all of the life of this man and what he did for the da'wah at that time. So you may even argue that amongst the ulama who lived in his time, because he lived in his time period with Shaykh Sa'di, Shaykh Mu'allimi, Shaykh Alamat al-Shinqiti, all those ulama, Ibn Baz, and of course the ulama after. But what's most notable, all of them would mention that he had fadl over them in certain angles that they didn't have. But what we might find today is that most of us are not very familiar with him. So that's why I want to focus on it, because we know his name, but we don't know his legacy, right? And so what we take from his life, amongst the many benefits, is ambition and da'wah to Allah, and being eager to call the people, to make effort. We find many of us, alhamdulillah, we've been blessed to be guided to know about Islam and the truth, and we study, alhamdulillah, weekly. Some of us, we study many lessons. But we need to also think bigger. What are we doing then to spread the haqq to other people? People in our lives, families, neighbors, friends. What do we tell them about Islam? How much do we care about them? And we find Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah, He describes them being Ra'ufur Rahim, one who was compassionate, one who was merciful to the believers. Harisun alayhim, he was eager for their guidance. And so for us, we need to take a lesson from this great Imam, that once he became guided, from then on he dedicated all his effort and resources to that. And we need to also then realize that this is our legacy of our ulama, that they learn and they study to act. And I want to complete by mentioning that Shaykh Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he mentioned a beautiful benefit, that what is the goal of the student of knowledge? What is their goal? And he said the reality is to be following the following things. Number one, you study, again, sincerely for Allah's sake. And secondly, then you act upon the knowledge you gained. And thirdly, you do da'wah ila Allah, and then you be patient. And this again is based on the ayah in Surah Al-Asr. But this idea, he said, the student knowledge doesn't study to waste time. He said the student knowledge doesn't study just to cut the time, to kill the time, and free, come to the lesson. You study sincerely to act upon it, then go. You have to have a ghaya, objective. What do you want to do with your knowledge and the benefit? Especially in the era we live in today, in which we find people are falling away from the deen, whatever it may be. due to maybe weakness in iman, shahawat, shubuhat. But we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing to guide them? How eager are we? So this is why I chose this imam amongst the great ulama I mentioned in this time period. Shaykh Abdul Rahman Nasir al-Sa'di, Shaykh Abdul Rahman Muallimi, Shaykh Alamat al-Shinqiti. These ulama were also great imams of the time. But we find in him uniqueness, and of course, if we had more time, we can narrate more of his stories. For example, he does mention when he went to India, he rode on an elephant, and it was experienced how fast the elephant was, and he didn't, first time he said, I experienced that, and other things that he found. And he also mentioned about him, hadith al-waqt, that one of his students said, I was with him during the travel, we went for hours traveling to Norway or Sweden, and he said, I never saw him waste any time. Writing poetry, reading this, memorizing that. He was half of the Quran, mutqin. He knew all the qira'at, and he also knew the different ones that were shad. So he said, I found him never wasting time. And so when you look at his biography, you see someone who in reality is a role model, but we can also take inspiration from him. Inshallah, we end with this much. Next week we'll finish the last biography of this series from a scholar from our time. Inshallah, if anyone has any questions or anything. No.
Any books translated by him in English still available besides the Quran?
There are some books translated in English from the Shaykh. I believe there's one about the importance of women learning how to write and the studying. There's a few other books. There's a book, I believe, that talks about some of his views about Isa alayhi salam or something like this. But there are a few small ones, but not most of them. So even that is now something which people are now trying to go back and find some of his work. There's in Arabic a 3-volume compilation of all his essays. So I believe now some people are trying to get some of that work out. But there is a few books on available. No, inshallah, yes.
How is Morocco now? Is that somewhere that people can go to study?
As for now, I don't know. Wallahu alam, the hal of Morocco in terms of study and stuff, I wouldn't know, yeah. Wallahu alam, yes.
Did he ever get married?
Yeah, the Shaykh got married. He had more than one wife, they mentioned. So he was one who got married in Medina, in Mecca, and others. He had wives from different places too. So he did, yes. Inshallah. And with this much, inshallah, subhanaka wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.